Welcome to Woven in True Crime. Today, we dive into a real story, full of mystery and tragedy. Although the events reported here are true, to protect the identities of those involved, names and locations have been changed. This is a case that deeply shook the community, revealing dark layers of manipulation, hidden secrets, and devastating consequences. Prepare to explore the details of this complex plot, where not everything is as it seems, and the true motive behind the events still defies the understanding of many. It was a foggy morning in July 2018 when the body of Ashley Rudolph, a 20-year-old young woman, was found on the sands of a deserted beach in California. At first, it seemed like just another isolated tragedy. The young woman had last been seen walking along the coast during a sports event that drew crowds to the inland part of the city. The dense fog that covered the region was thought to be responsible for her disappearance. Initial reports indicated that she had gotten lost in the dark, cold waters, where the merciless sea had claimed her. However, as the days passed, doubts began to arise. Those who knew Ashley knew she wasn't the kind of person to put herself in dangerous situations. She had always been careful, responsible, a cheerful young woman with a bright future ahead. But, in the months leading up to her disappearance, something about her had changed. Her closest friends noticed her strange behavior and growing reclusiveness. What had happened to the girl everyone knew so well? When news of her death reached the small town, the shock was immediate. Ashley was an ordinary young woman, known by everyone. The quiet coastal community was soon enveloped in a cloud of sadness and confusion. Her contagious smile and welcoming manner had been abruptly taken from everyone. Her parents were devastated. Neighbors wondered how such a tragedy could have happened to someone so young and full of life. And it was then that Samantha and Scott, a couple who had recently grown close to Ashley, began to be mentioned. Samantha, older and filled with a strange aura of confidence, had met Ashley months before her death. They had become close suddenly and intensely. Ashley, who had previously been so connected to her family and friends, began to distance herself, falling into an uncomfortable silence. Samantha and Scott seemed to have a disturbing influence over her, something that no one could fully explain. At first, few dared to mention the couple openly. But those who paid attention to Ashley's last interactions with Samantha noticed that something was wrong. The relationship between them seemed deeper and more complicated than a simple friendship. As rumors spread through the town, the doubt lingered in the air: was it really an accident? As the police began gathering evidence about the case, new questions arose. Why had Ashley, a healthy and cautious young woman, disappeared under such suspicious circumstances? And what role did Samantha and Scott play in her life? What had seemed like a simple tragedy was starting to transform into a mystery that would shake the community's foundations. However, as the days passed, the first clues began to emerge, and nothing was as it seemed. Ashley Rudolph was a well-known and beloved young woman in her small coastal town. Raised in a warm environment, she was a lively person with a charming personality that captivated everyone around her. Her ambitions were simple but full of hope: to travel, study, and perhaps one day return to contribute to the community where she grew up. Until then, she had always been the kind of person everyone trusted, someone who maintained a close relationship with her parents and childhood friends. However, in the months leading up to her death, things began to change in subtle but disturbing ways. Close friends noticed that Ashley had become more distant, less communicative. Frequent outings and constant socializing were gradually replaced by long periods of silence and isolation. The sparkle she used to have in her eyes was slowly fading, but no one knew exactly what was happening. It was during this period that Samantha and Scott appeared in her life. Samantha, older and mysterious, met Ashley at an event in town and, somehow, quickly gained her trust. At first, no one paid much attention to Ashley's new circle of friends, but the changes in her behavior became increasingly evident as she spent more time with the couple. Few people knew Scott directly, but rumors about him, his controlling personality and involvement with eccentric practices, soon spread through the community. Ashley's parents were worried. They tried, unsuccessfully, to get closer to their daughter and understand what was happening. Whenever they asked about Samantha and Scott, she would dodge the question or get irritated. For them, it was difficult to comprehend how a girl who always shared everything with her family had become so reserved and evasive. Friends also noticed that when Ashley appeared at gatherings, she seemed distracted, as if she were somewhere else, lost in thought. No one could have imagined that behind this change in behavior was a carefully orchestrated manipulation. In the community, the shock of Ashley's death wasn't limited to the tragedy itself but to the fact that no one seemed to have noticed how vulnerable she had become. Conversations in the streets revolved around the same questions: how had such a promising young woman gotten involved with Samantha and Scott? Was there something sinister going on that had escaped everyone's attention? The town was in mourning, but also haunted by a disturbing sense of guilt, as if everyone, in some way, had missed the signs. Over time, speculation began to gain traction. Some friends believed that Ashley had been emotionally manipulated by the couple. Others said she had been convinced to participate in something she didn't fully understand. The conversations, increasingly filled with doubt and regret, fueled an atmosphere of mystery. Doubts were spreading, but nothing could prepare the community for what was to come. On the morning of Ashley Rudolph's disappearance, the fog wrapped around the deserted beach like a thick veil, muffling any sound. While the wind blew cold along the coast, the town was bustling with a local sports event, but no one was paying much attention to that isolated part of the beach, where Samantha, Scott, and Ashley had gone. The couple, who insisted they were there just to meditate, seemed calm. However, something in the story they told the police felt wrong from the start. Samantha explained that after the ritual, Ashley had decided to walk alone to reflect, but she ended up disappearing into the sea due to the low visibility caused by the fog. Scott, by her side, remained silent, nervously avoiding eye contact while Samantha spoke to the police calmly and calculatedly. Samantha's calmness sharply contrasted with Scott's noticeable tension, who avoided answering any direct questions. At first, the police treated the case as a possible accidental drowning. The current in that area could be treacherous, and with the combination of fog and wind, the explanation seemed plausible. However, while rescue teams combed the beach in search of any trace of Ashley, something bothered the investigators. Samantha remained cold, distant, almost apathetic to the disappearance of her supposed friend. Scott, on the other hand, was restless. He was sweating slightly, and his inability to make eye contact was noticed by everyone. With each passing day without finding the body, the town's anxiety grew. Helicopters hovered over the coast, and divers scoured the waters, but there was no sign of Ashley. The silence and constant fog on the beach began to become a symbol of the mystery surrounding the disappearance. The locals, who had initially believed in the drowning hypothesis, began to wonder if something darker had happened that morning. Then an unexpected twist completely changed the course of the investigation. During a routine check of Ashley's belongings, investigators discovered documents indicating that, months before her death, the young woman had signed 6 life insurance policies, all in Samantha's name. This immediately raised suspicions. How could someone so young and apparently inexperienced have signed so many policies? And why was Samantha, who claimed to be just a friend, the beneficiary of all of them? This discovery shifted the focus of the investigation. What had seemed like a tragic accident was now beginning to shape up as a possible premeditated crime. Investigators began pressing the couple. Scott, visibly shaken, began stumbling over his own words during a second round of interrogations. He tried to justify Ashley's involvement in the insurance, saying she had trusted Samantha, but he couldn't explain why so many policies had been signed in such a short time. Samantha, on the other hand, remained firm, but her statements began to sound rehearsed. When detectives pressed for more details, her quick and precise answers left an unsettling impression. It was as if she knew exactly what to say to avoid suspicion, but her coldness only increased the discomfort. Even in the face of incisive questions, she never hesitated, something investigators began to interpret as a sign that Samantha was much more involved than she let on. The community, which until then had believed they were dealing with an accidental tragedy, began murmuring about the possibility of financial fraud. The discovery of the insurance policies caused deep shock, but at the same time, it fueled speculation about the couple's true motivations. But what the police found next turned a simple disappearance into a much darker mystery than anyone could have imagined. After discovering the life insurance policies, the investigation into Ashley's disappearance took an even darker turn. The police, now aware that the young woman's death was no simple accident, intensified their efforts to uncover what had happened in the final months of her life. Small details that had once seemed insignificant now revealed the control Samantha exercised over Ashley. Among Ashley's friends, uncomfortable memories began to surface. One of her friends recalled a conversation, months earlier, where Ashley mentioned that Samantha was helping her discover her true essence. At the time, it seemed like an innocent conversation, but now, with the weight of the disappearance hanging over their heads, those words carried a sinister tone. Samantha's fascination with spiritual rituals and esotericism was proving to be more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The search of Samantha and Scott's house brought a disturbing discovery: a secret room, decorated with occult symbols, black candles melted to the ground, and old books on the occult. The strong smell of burnt incense still lingered in the air, and the walls were covered with hand-drawn symbols that exuded a sense of darkness. It was a place of shadows and secrets, where Samantha's control over others seemed to physically manifest. For the investigators, the environment was clear evidence that the couple was involved in something much deeper and more macabre than just a friendship with Ashley. As investigators tried to process the extent of the evidence, Scott began to fall apart. During his second interrogation, his calm facade evaporated. When confronted with the discovery of the esoteric room, he began to stammer, tripping over his words as he tried to justify the place's existence. His hands visibly trembled, and sweat dripped from his forehead. This was her doing, he mumbled, placing all the blame on Samantha. Every time he seemed on the verge of completely collapsing, a cold glance from Samantha silenced him, as if she controlled him even in the smallest interactions. Scott knew that, more than the investigators, it was her he feared. Samantha, on the other hand, remained serene, almost defiant. Even when the police pressed for more direct answers, she never lost her composure. Her answers, quick and rehearsed, demonstrated calculated control. Every word seemed carefully chosen to divert attention. But the investigators began to realize that her apparent tranquility was actually a facade. Something much deeper and more dangerous lay behind that calm exterior, and they were beginning to unravel it. The tensions between the couple were palpable. Scott, increasingly close to a breakdown, seemed on the verge of confessing something, but he always backed off at the last moment, as if his fear of Samantha was greater than any legal punishment he might receive. The dynamic between the two revealed that Samantha was in control, manipulating Scott with precision. She didn't need to say much, just a look, a slight nod, and he would fall silent and retreat. Then, the forensic investigation revealed a devastating detail: traces of consciousness-altering drugs were found in Ashley's body. These substances, administered over the course of months, kept her in a state of confusion and vulnerability. For the police, this was confirmation that Ashley had been physically and mentally controlled. What had once seemed like a tragic disappearance now revealed itself as premeditated manipulation, a web of lies carefully woven by Samantha and Scott. The final revelation came from one of Ashley's closest friends, who, when interrogated again, remembered a disturbing secret: Ashley was pregnant. At first, it seemed like an unfounded rumor, but tests confirmed the pregnancy, and the father was Scott. The news devastated everyone who knew the young woman. The pregnancy, far from being a simple accident, was part of a macabre plan orchestrated by Samantha, involving rituals and manipulation. The community was in shock when the news spread. In cafes, on the streets, and at corners, people whispered, "How had no one noticed? How could someone so loved be used in such a way?" The shock, mixed with guilt, enveloped the town in a heavy mourning. And then the evidence brought to light a long-buried secret, something no one was prepared to face. The case was about to explode. The discoveries of Ashley's pregnancy and the drugs administered to her changed the course of the investigation, revealing a darker plot than anyone could have imagined. With each new piece of evidence, it became clear that Ashley's disappearance was part of something much deeper and premeditated. Scott's increasingly unstable behavior indicated that he was on the verge of a breakdown. The interrogation room was suffocating with tension. Scott, now collapsing under the weight of guilt, could barely keep his hands steady. They trembled slightly as he avoided looking directly at the detectives, fixing his gaze on the floor, as if it were the only way to escape the reality surrounding him. Silence hung in the air as the investigators watched in anticipation, knowing he was on the verge of confessing. Scott's breathing was irregular. Fear and guilt were building up inside him, and his pale face reflected the inner turmoil consuming him. Slowly, the breakdown the investigators had been expecting began to unfold. His words came hesitantly and fragmented, revealing a truth more horrifying than anyone had anticipated. Under Samantha's manipulation, they had planned something far more macabre than just collecting the life insurance money. Samantha believed that Ashley's child, the baby she was carrying, would be the key to a ritual that would bring power and wealth to the couple. Scott, who until then had remained in the shadows, revealed that, for months, Ashley had been kept in a state of confusion, unable to discern reality from the illusions imposed on her. The pregnancy, which had seemed like a tragic accident, had been carefully planned by Samantha as part of a dark ritual. The investigators listened to every detail in horror. Scott, unable to hold back the tears, let all the guilt he felt show. His hands, now trembling and sweaty, gripped the table tightly as he struggled to maintain his composure. The truth, however, was undeniable. They had used Ashley as a pawn in a twisted game, manipulating her physically and mentally to achieve an insane goal. Samantha, who had until then maintained her rigid control over the situation, began to lose her composure. Scott's revelation shattered the image of serenity she had built. Her mask of indifference began to crack, and behind it emerged a mixture of fury and despair. Her presence, once imposing, now seemed fragile. The control she had exerted over Scott and the situation was disintegrating before everyone's eyes. The impact of the revelations was devastating. For the detectives, the case had turned into something far darker than a simple insurance fraud. The ritualistic sacrifice of an innocent young woman was at the heart of the plot. Scott's words, filled with guilt and remorse, painted a clear picture of how Samantha had manipulated everyone around her, using fear and illusion to bend them to her will. The town, which had once mourned what seemed like a tragic accident, now found itself confronted with an unspeakable horror. When news of the satanic ritual and the manipulation of Ashley spread through the community, the shock was palpable. People reacted with disbelief and sadness. Ashley's smiling face was now remembered with a mix of sorrow and anger. How had no one noticed what was happening? How had such a promising young woman been dragged into something so cruel and disturbing? Scott, now a completely broken man, couldn't stop shaking. He had surrendered to the truth, knowing that there was no longer any way to escape the consequences of his actions. He completely collapsed, revealing all the details of the macabre plan Samantha had devised. His eyes, full of fear and despair, revealed the terror he felt when he realized the true power Samantha had held over him all that time. Samantha, on the other hand, tried to regain control of the situation, but Scott's confession had destroyed any chance of manipulation. Her exterior calm had disappeared, replaced by a growing anxiety that, for a long time, she had managed to hide. Her control was crumbling, and the investigators could see it. She tried to deny everything, but her attempts to blame Scott were visibly desperate. The detectives, now with all the evidence in hand, knew the case was nearing its end, but one question remained: what had truly motivated all this? Even with the confessions, there was still a sense that something more was hidden, buried deep within Samantha's manipulative mind, something that might never be fully revealed. But, despite all the answers that emerged, one question still lingered: what motivated all this? And has the whole truth been revealed? Scott's confessions and the damning evidence against Samantha brought a sense of closure to the investigators, but the emotional weight of the revelations was impossible to ignore. The truth about what happened to Ashley had emerged, leaving a permanent mark on everyone involved in the case. As the investigation neared its conclusion, the impact of the discoveries began to spread throughout the town. The community, which had once mourned Ashley's disappearance as a common tragedy, now found itself in a state of shock and disbelief. The details about Samantha's control, the occult rituals, and the planned sacrifice were almost impossible to process. On the streets, conversations were whispered, and Ashley's name was mentioned with a mix of grief and guilt. No one could understand how such a lively young woman had been involved in something so macabre. People who knew Ashley, childhood friends, teachers, neighbors, were devastated. Many questioned whether they could have done something to prevent her death. Small signs that had been ignored now seemed too obvious to have gone unnoticed. There was a growing sense of collective guilt in the town, as if everyone, in some way, had failed to protect a girl who had slowly distanced herself from the world she knew. Meanwhile, Ashley's family was in deep mourning. Her parents, in particular, were torn apart by grief. The answers that finally arrived brought a bitter sense of closure. Knowing what had happened to their daughter, even though it was horrifying, provided some resolution, but the loss was unbearable. The truth that had been revealed only intensified the void left by Ashley. As the investigation progressed, the case was brought to justice. Samantha and Scott's trial began quickly, and the evidence against them was overwhelming. Scott's confession, the drugs found in Ashley's body, and the insurance policies revealed the diabolical plan in disturbing detail. Samantha, though she tried to defend herself, was seen as the mastermind behind everything, and the weight of responsibility fell on her shoulders. In court, the atmosphere was tense. Samantha's presence, with her aura of manipulation and control, still made everyone uncomfortable. However, the calm she once exhibited had vanished. During the trial, she seemed like an empty figure, far from the imposing woman who had kept Scott and Ashley under her domain. Her attempt to manipulate the facts and blame Scott failed, and the court, like the town, began to see the true extent of her evil control. Scott, on the other hand, was no longer the man who had collaborated with Samantha in the plans. He was broken, consumed by guilt, aware that he could never escape the consequences of his actions. His presence at the trial was almost passive, as if the weight of the truth had already destroyed any remaining resistance he might have had. His conviction seemed like a mere formality. The case not only shocked the town but also gained national notoriety. The news of the macabre ritual and Ashley's manipulation spread quickly, generating indignation and morbid fascination among the public. Outsiders began to see the town differently, as if the place once seen as a peaceful refuge was now forever tainted by a crime so cruel and incomprehensible. However, despite justice being served, a cloud of uncertainty and discomfort remained over the town. There was something about the case that, for many, still didn't make complete sense. The nature of Samantha's control, the depth of her beliefs, and the mystery surrounding what truly motivated her still seemed to elude everyone's understanding. Although the court had reached a verdict, the feeling that something more remained hidden couldn't be ignored. Despite the evidence, a crucial detail still didn't fit. Something was out of place, and perhaps the story wasn't over. The trial of Samantha and Scott ended with their convictions, but the weight of the revelations still hung over everyone involved. The heinous crime that shocked the town and the country left deep scars, and even with justice being served, there was an unsettling sense that something remained unexplained. The dark plot involving rituals, manipulation, and sacrifices had shaken the community, and the sense of normalcy seemed increasingly unreachable. Samantha's figure, even incarcerated, continued to unsettle. Reports from the prison suggested that her behavior was disturbing. She spent hours sitting in silence, her eyes fixed on an invisible point, while whispers circulated among the guards about the effect her presence had on other inmates. Some avoided crossing her path, as if they still feared the hidden power she wielded. There were stories of inmates claiming to have seen her talking to herself at night, murmuring words in an unknown language, and how her cell always seemed colder than the others. Meanwhile, Scott, now completely destroyed by guilt, had become a faded and almost unrecognizable figure. His defeated posture and vacant stare reflected a man who had lost any will to fight. He barely moved, as if each day was a repetition of the torment he had created. His presence at the trial was almost spectral, and his conviction seemed like a mere formality, for the real punishment was already inside him. Outside, the town struggled to recover. National headlines continued to attract reporters, who constantly visited the quiet streets, now stained by the crime. The residents, once proud of their peaceful community, now felt exposed. In cafes and at corners, whispered conversations carried Ashley's name, always with a tone of regret and guilt. The peace had been violated in an irreparable way, and no one could forget what had happened there. The detectives who worked on the case couldn't completely distance themselves from the shadow Samantha left behind either. In the silent corridors of the police station, some case files still remained untouched, as if there was something no one wanted to reopen. Documents with strange notes, hand-drawn symbols, and codes that were never deciphered continued to fuel the sense that something much bigger was still hidden. One of the investigators, in a moment of reflection, murmured to his colleague, "I don't think we'll ever know what she really wanted." The impact on Ashley's family was devastating. Her parents, consumed by grief, tried to find some sense in the midst of the tragedy. The truth revealed during the trial brought a sense of closure, but not relief. Frequent visits to their daughter's grave were the only comfort they found. On a cold afternoon, standing before the headstone, the wind seemed to whisper memories of what would never be fully understood. There, hand in hand, Ashley's parents stood in silence, dealing with a loss that time could never heal. Even with the case closed, the echo of unanswered questions continued to haunt everyone. The real motivation behind the ritual remained vague. What had Samantha truly sought by attempting the sacrifice? The explanations about power and wealth seemed superficial, and the symbols found in the notebooks, drawn with disturbing precision, were never fully deciphered. It was as if the answers were always out of reach, buried along with the secrets Samantha carried within her. The public remained fascinated by the mystery, and reporters still appeared in the town from time to time, searching for any new detail that might feed their stories. The cameras continued to point at the faces of the residents, as if they were waiting for a new revelation, something that would fully explain what had happened. For many in the town, this was a constant reminder that the terror of the past would never be completely overcome. Samantha, imprisoned, seemed to know this. Her silence and her posture, even behind bars, suggested that she still held secrets. The guards kept their distance, and those forced to interact with her whispered about how the air around her always seemed colder, as if something deeper and darker remained unchanged. Her notebooks, her notes, the strange symbols, all of it continued to hover over the case like pieces of a puzzle that would never be completely assembled. But to this day, the questions persist: what really happened that night? And have all the secrets truly been revealed?